I want to talk about commitment. Commitment is actually on the wane. Did you know that? That our sense of commitment as a culture and as a society is on the wane. It's starting to decrease. Sociologists are recognizing that, and they say one of the things that distinguishes the modern or postmodern mind in Western culture from other cultures as well as other time periods is that this sense of commitment has given way to personal choice. Let me explain what that means. That is, if given the decision between a personal choice that we think fulfills some need of ours, or a commitment or obligation, we're going to choose the choice instead of meeting the obligation. Peter Berger is an American sociologist, and I came across this quote from him. Peter Berger said, "The modern mind is distinguished by this. To the modern person, our own needs and our own fulfillment is more real to us than any other obligation." So let me try to make this real in your life. Think about some of the roles that you have. Maybe you're a mother, or a father, or a brother, or a sister. We're all sons or daughters of somebody. Think about your role in your work, whether it's work you're paid for, or volunteer work. Are you a teacher? Are you a doctor? Are you a factory worker? Do you volunteer at the hospital? Are you a member of the church? Are you the member of some board or some charity? Think about your obligations in all of those areas. And let's make it really, really real. So let's say that you're a parent, and the little monster in the room next door to you all of a sudden starts crying in the middle of the night. Now, if it's about you needing to fulfill your own need and your own desire, well, your own need and desire is to stay in bed and get the sleep that you need. But if you're a good parent, you know that you set aside that need and you go over to that child, the little monster, and you explain for the upteenth time, there is no monster under the bed. I promise you, there's no monster under the bed. Because you know that that's your obligation. So we see this waning of commitment. And I want to talk about commitment this morning. And I could go to all places in the Bible that lay out certain commitments that we have. But I want to talk about the most important commitment this morning. Your commitment to Jesus Christ. And it shouldn't surprise you, because we're going through a sermon series in Mark, that I want to look at a passage in Mark's gospel that shows us and teaches us about our commitment to Jesus. So would you turn with me to the first chapter of the Gospel of Mark? That's chapter 1. We're going to start in verse 16 of that first chapter. And if you're using the Black Pew Bible that's in front of you, you're going to find that on page 1552, Mark 1:16. And these are the words that we read there. As Jesus walked beside the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and his brother Andrew casting a net into the lake, for they were fishermen. "Come, follow me," Jesus said, "and I will make you fishers of men." Now, something similar happens if we jump over to verse 19. When he had gone a little farther, he saw James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John in a boat preparing their nets. Without delay, he called them. I want you to look at those verses. Who is taking the initiative in these verses? He saw, he said, he called, he said, I will make you. Who's taking the initiative? Jesus is taking the initiative. Now, this is radical. I want you to think about how radical it is that Jesus is taking the initiative here. For most rabbis or religious leaders, their students are the ones that take the initiative. That is, if they want to study under a rabbi or some religious leader, they need to prove that they're worthy of that religious leader and that rabbi's time. But Jesus is doing something here. He is taking the initiative. This is like the president of Harvard or Yale driving to your house and saying, we want you to come to Harvard. We want you to come to Yale. You don't have to fill out an application. We just want you there. It's radical. Jesus is taking the initiative here, and you need to keep that in mind. He's the one taking the initiative. And what is he requesting or calling Simon and Andrew and James and John to do? What is he asking them to do? Well, he's asking them to make a radical commitment. And let me show you what I mean by that. If you look at that passage again, in verse 17 it says, come follow me. That phrase, follow me, in the Greek is a common Greek phrase that is used to describe the relationship between a student and his or her teacher. And then if you jump down to verse 20, at the very end of that verse, it says that they followed him. And that word followed, Mark could have used here a very simple Greek word, erkomai. But instead he uses a compound word, it's op-erkomai. And that technical term is used of someone who leaves a place in order to be an adherent of someone. This is a very radical commitment that Jesus is asking them to make. He's not just saying, hey, you know what? Come follow me, let's go to the movies. There's something really good playing at the theater. He's not even saying, hey, come over here, check out what I can do. He's saying, come be my follower, be an adherent of me. Go where I go, do the things I do, mimic me in ministry. That's what he's asking them to do. Now, why in the world would Simon, Andrew, James, and John do this? What is Jesus promising them? Well, it tells us in verse 17, I will make you fishers of men, make you fishers of people. Well, what does Jesus mean by that? I mean, if you really think about it literally, it conjures up some really weird things. Is he talking about, getting people in a net and hauling them up so you have this net filled with all these people? Is he talking about a congregation filled with people with hooks coming out of their mouth? I mean, what is he talking about? Well, if we want to know what Jesus means by being a fisher of people, we need to look at the rest of the gospel. We need to look at the context. What does Jesus have these men doing later on in the gospel? Well, later on in Mark, in chapter 3, he's going to appoint these four as part of the 12. And the 12, it says that Jesus gave them authority to teach and to cast out demons. And then later on in chapter 6, he's going to send them out in pairs. And he's going to give them authority to cast out unclean spirits. And then when they go out and they start doing the ministry, they're going to be reporting back that they're doing the very things that Jesus does. To be a fisher of people means that you teach the things that Jesus taught. To be a fisher of people means that you do the things that Jesus did. It means that you proclaim this message of the kingdom that Jesus proclaimed. That's what it means to be a fisher of people. Now, I want you to look at who Jesus is calling. He's not calling anyone that has phenomenal qualifications. These are not people that have been studying the Torah or the law. These are just common, everyday fishermen, hard workers, doing their job. They had no special training. There was nothing to really qualify them for what Jesus was going to do. And maybe you kind of feel unqualified for this call that Jesus requests us to commit our lives to. How am I supposed to break this kingdom into the world? How am I, little old me, how am I supposed to have any role in doing anything really great in this world? Many of you are probably familiar with the poet T.S. Eliot. Do you know T.S. Eliot? Real famous poet. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Probably one of the greatest poets of our time. Well, apparently, T.S. Eliot, in a letter that he wrote to Emily Hale, his confidant, he wrote these words to his confidant, and this is T.S. Eliot, one of the greatest poets of our time. I have been struggling all of my life with the problem of putting things into words. Now think about this. Did Jesus say you will be fishers of people? Look at the passage. No, he said, I will make you fishers of people. If T.S. Eliot struggled his entire life to put things into words and could be one of the greatest poets of our time, what do you think you can do if the maker of heaven and earth says that I will make you fishers of people? Now, this call must have seemed ludicrous. Now, Mark is very brief here. He doesn't give us all the details. But there was a lot more going on here than just what Mark described. Can you imagine the scene here? I mean, Simon would have had to go to his wife. We know he was married. Simon, who was later called Peter, we know he was married. And he would have had to have discussion. Hey, dear, I met this man, and he has invited me to go on this business trip of an indefinite time. I don't know how long I'm going to be gone. I don't know how often I'll be able to stop home. But you know what? He's called me to do that, and you know what? I think I'm going to do it. I mean, can you imagine that discussion? I mean, can you imagine discussion that James and John would have had with Zebedee, their father? I mean, their father Zebedee, I mean, think about old Zebedee there. He must have been ready to pick up the phone and call the therapist right there when his son said, hey, we're going to go. We're going to go into the great wide blue and follow this teacher that we've recently met and think that there's something here and we need to go do it. To most of the world, to follow Jesus in this kind of way, to make this kind of commitment, it seems ludicrous. But it's not something you should do carefree. Remember, we're talking about commitment here. This isn't a commitment that's going to come with a lot of obligations. It's not something you should wade into too lightly. What do Simon and Andrew and James and John do? Well, it says of Simon and Andrew that they left their net and they went and followed after Jesus. Leaving their net, they did a lot more than just leave their net. This is highly symbolic action here. Simon and Andrew left much more than their net the day that they left it. People can leave their nets for all sorts of reasons. There might have been a family emergency and they just need to drop it and run. There might have been just laziness and they forgot to get their nets together. It could have just been that some amnesia kicked in and they forgot to pack up their nets. No, they left them there for a reason. And James and John, they left their father in the boat with the hired workers. They left. And it's an amazing thing that they did. And I want you to think about this question. What are your nets? What are the nets that you need to lay down? They're not always exterior things. They're not always money. They're not always a lucrative career like James and John. They're not always nets. They're not always relationships. Sometimes they're internal things. Sometimes there are things like fear, like I'm just afraid if I go and I make this commitment, what's really going to happen? Sometimes there's feel of failure. If I step out and try to do something really amazing for Jesus, what if I just royally fail? And then there's internal things like pride. You know, you can actually be a really good person, an upstanding citizen, and still be holding on to your nets. If you're doing all those good things just because you want to feel good about yourself, because it massages your ego, you're actually still holding on to your nets. You haven't let them go for Jesus. You haven't said to him, anything that you want me to leave behind, even if it's everything, whatever it is, whatever the cost of following you, I'll do it. And if you're making conditions on Jesus, saying, you know what, I'll follow you, Jesus, if it makes me feel good and happy. Or I'll follow you, Jesus, if I know that everything is going to work out. Or I'll follow you, Jesus, if you lay out the plan and how everything is going to look. Or I'll follow you, Jesus, if I can just hold on to this part of my life or hold on to this lifestyle. I'll follow you, Jesus, if I can just do that. If you're making conditions to Jesus, if you're holding on to your nets, you know, you really haven't let him go. You're just some guy or you're just some gal on a shore by a lake holding on to a net as the best thing that ever walked this earth passes you by. So should you make this commitment? I mean, should you make this commitment because some pastor told you or because it says it in the Bible? You know, pastors say all sorts of really bizarre things, and some of them you might not want to do. In the Bible, yeah, you should follow the Bible. It is God's word. But you know what? There's actually a much more practical reason to do it. Because the benefits far outweigh the cost. Jesus once told a parable about a pearl that had incredible value. And it was being sold for an undervalued price. And a merchant came by and instantly knew how much that pearl was worth. And it was going to cost him everything. So he sold it all, and he purchased that pearl. It's kind of like this. Let's say that you know that there's some property that has millions of dollars of oil underneath of it. But the owner and nobody else knows it. And the owner is selling that piece of property well under value. But you know what? Even though it's well under value, and even though you know what's underneath the ground is worth millions and millions of dollars, it's going to cost you every single penny you have in order to buy that parcel of land. If you were wise, you would. You would do it. You would sell every single thing you had, purchase that parcel of land because you know the benefits. What you would get out of it would far outweigh anything it would cost you, whether comfort or security or anything else. You know that it will deliver so much more. Are you ready to let down your nets to commit to Jesus? Are you ready to let down your nets to commit to Jesus? I want to end with a story that was told to Timothy Keller by one of his professors. And Roger Wagner isn't here, but this gentleman actually taught at Gordon Conwell, where Roger and I went to seminary, not when I was there, but when Roger was there, and I wanted to know if he knew. But we'll have to, so you all, that's your homework. Ask Roger if he knows if Addison Leet taught at Gordon Conwell when he went there. Addison Leet, okay? That's our homework. We'll figure this out together. I just want to know. Anyway, so Addison Leet, he told this story, and it was a true story about these two young girls that Dr. Leet knew. And they came to know Jesus in college. They gave their life to Jesus in college. and they decided to get some medical training. And they did that, but they didn't complete their studies. Instead, they decided to get involved with this overseas mission board in Africa. And they knew that they wanted to do three things. Number one, they knew they wanted to go to Africa. Number two, they knew that they wanted to be some part of community health in Africa. They didn't want to be doctors, they didn't want to be nurses, but they wanted to be there and they wanted to help out with that type of work. And number three, they knew that they wanted to share their faith with the people in Africa. So they decided to do just that. They decided to become missionaries and go to Africa. Well, you know how the story goes. Well, the two young girls, they need to tell their parents about their plans to become missionaries. And you can imagine how the conversation went. Happens with, a lot of parents who are kind of nominal Christians, but, they're just get a little bit weary when all of a sudden, the kids start talking about radically following Jesus in some way. And they just said, "Dears, this is a wonderful thing. You had a religious experience. We're so happy for you. And we think that this thing that you want to do, we just think it's great. But don't you think that you should at least go and get a master's degree so that you have a little bit of security just in case things don't work out before you go out into the great blue?" And Addison Leet, Dr. Leet said, "Okay, let me get this right. We're on a little rock in space that we call Earth. And it's spinning through the universe at millions and billions of miles per hour. And if perchance, by chance, it doesn't hit something or run into something along the way, it really doesn't matter. Because every single one of us has a trap door underneath of us. And one day, that trap door is going to open, and we're going to fall down through that trap door, and we're either going to land into the everlasting arms of God or absolutely nothing. But make sure you get a master's degree for just a little bit of security, for a safety net. Are you ready to lay down your nets for the sake of Jesus and the gospel he came to proclaim? Are you ready to join the mission? Because it's going to cost you some comfort. It's going to cost you some security from time to time. It's going to require some sacrifices. Are you ready to let down the nets? Are you ready to buy the pearl? Because anything else in life is rubbish compared to the value of entering into that kingdom, being in the presence of the King, having fellowship with the King, and telling everyone else in the world just how wonderful, beautiful, and pure Jesus and his kingdom really is. Please, as you're able, let us rise and sing.